I would be shooting a scene, he's not even in it, for like an hour, and then at some point I'd be like, "Hey, it looks good." And I'd look over and like Danny DeVito would be sitting on an apple box in our tent, and I'm like, "How long has he been there?" Like people would just come, he didn't like hanging in the trailer. People would hang out. I don't know. It was a really fun vibe.
I guess the first thing I wanted to ask you was how much did you pull from, if any, like the actual ride, the actual attraction when you were first like getting the look of the movie together and kind of like how much influence did that have?
I think that probably had the ultimate influence for us early on.
Yeah.
Justin, huge fan of the ride, was like a Disney cast member in a previous life. Truly, Darren Guilford, the production designer, pulling details down to all the woodwork. Um, for cinematography, it's interesting because it is a live ride. It's a short ride, and there's not a lot that would equate to modern cinematography there. There's obviously the things I could pull from is a lot of candlelight, a lot of moonlight. Some of their moonlight colors would go on to influence, like their green moonlight would become our like ghost girl moonlight color. Any use of fog, any use of sort of the colors from the crystal ball, all these sort of color references and light that worked live were kind of woven in. That said, there was a lot of sort of the fabric of what this movie looks like that had to sort of be created, hopefully in celebration of the ride, based on these sort of elements of the ride, but it has its own sort of quality to it that can do what the ride does so miraculously, which is like be a little bit scary and be a little bit light when it needs to. Thread that.
That was actually kind of one of the other things I wanted to ask was like, how do you find the balance of making it a little spooky and like bringing that in while also making it kind of accessible for everyone? Is that a challenge at all?
Yeah, that was kind of the big sort of overarching, like, what is the look of this thing? Can it look like a horror movie? Can it still be funny if it is like, not a sort of big bright movie like the last iteration of this movie was? And I kind of decided that neither felt right, and that it might have a better time sort of pivoting from spooky to funny if it had its own sort of timeless, painterly look to it. And when I started seeing Darren Guilford's sets, these big sort of Gothic, Southern Gothic, aged, beautiful wooden doorways and woodwork and all that stuff, I was like, okay, yeah, this sort of formal, atmospheric and painterly vibe allows us to, at one point, turn the lights off and we're moonlighted and it's scary and sort of still has this sort of, I wouldn't say like a jarring horror vibe, but has this sort of creepy ambience. And then at the same time, have enough richness when it's candlelit to light, these larger than life characters in a way that doesn't feel like, why are they making jokes when it's like this dead serious, terrifying? Yeah. So it was definitely the hardest sort of weave, but I think creating like shape and mood, keeping things spooky but not horrific, was kind of the move.
You just touched on this like very, very briefly, but I'm curious, was the 20 years ago movie, was that something that you watched in preparation for this to like see what was going on there, see if there's anything you wanted to pull from or not pull from, or did you not really think about it?
I kind of turned it on to see what was going on. I think there was just a pervasive attitude going into this that we were going to reference the ride and not any other super specific source where this is going to come from. We didn't talk about this movie very much. I watched some of it. I like Eddie Murphy. I had fun with what I saw. I knew it was very different from our script and very different from like what our visual approach was going to be. So that was kind of my sense of that.
And you kind of mentioned this too, but like I noticed when I was watching it, especially in a lot of the early outdoor stuff, there's a lot of shooting at night, a lot of stuff in the dark, and it looks really good. Like everything's clear. It still looks dark, but like, yeah, it looks great. Is that a hard thing to achieve at all?
It is. It's something that takes a lot of thought and preparation. There's a lot of different ways to approach darkness. I knew for like Disney and for like kids and for like a modern viewer that just letting things be super dark is not interesting. I did want it to though feel like what it feels like to look in the dark, and what we actually see in the dark isn't just pitch blackness. It's actually our rods and cones struggling to fill in all the shadows. So it's actually this sort of lower contrast, but kind of our ability to see color is sort of warped, and so it becomes this sort of silvery kind of world where I was hoping that like subconsciously when people see it this way, it feels like it's actually really dark. You can actually see in all the shadows. It's kind of a unique, tricky thing to try to do. But the way we did it was these sort of enormous soft boxes on really low levels, always sort of filling in the shadows. Haze always helping to lift the shadows just a little bit too. And then sort of having our key lights and our moonlights be the really bright things that sort of pierce, but they're not piercing blackness. They're piercing just a very low level. So yeah, that was the key to kind of creating a moonlight vibe that felt dark, felt spooky, but actually had all the information there.
I mean, the sets look great in this. I'm curious how much were you actually working on a set, and how much was kind of green screeny, like,
Yeah.
well, yeah, put in after.
The great thing is like the house was really all built, which was awesome. Like the foyer, the stretching room, the library, the dining room, the main hallway, those staircases where the like suit of armor is, all that is one contiguous place where we could turn around a corner and it would all be real, and the actors could actually be in a real space. And that was something Justin really fought for. Is like, it needed to be at least a real house with real wood and real finishing, real marble, like really beautifully done. Even the exterior outside, the first tier of it was actually all completed and aged and all that. It's continued above that, but the pillars and the walkway and the stairs and that whole driveway and the way down to the gate was all practical. That gate connected to a place in New Orleans that was that line of like cypress or like Spanish moss trees. There was another gate there for all that sort of stuff up and down that, and then the final, and then all the hallways, Ben's house, the facade of which was built in the French Quarter for real, interior on the stage. The main thing that I would say was like a set extension or more virtual was the finale graveyard. It was on a big stage. There were a lot of real trees. There were a lot of sort of land masses and these islands that would sort of separate. Anything going deep into the distance was completed by friends at ILM. There, but yeah,
that sounds like it would have been very, very fun to work on. I mean, there's an insane amount of like the most talented actors around, pretty much like in one place on this. Like, what was the environment on set? Was it super, like, was it very collaborative? Were people kind of jumping in with ideas and stuff, or sticking with the script pretty much? How was it?
I think everybody was sort of coming in with their own energy for sure. I mean, when you get those people together, there's just a lot of ideas and a lot of there's a lot of outbursts and fun sort of improvs and different variations, different kind of takes that Justin's getting out of them. I would say just the vibe was always really fun. I mean, you got like I would be shooting a scene, he's not even in it, for like an hour, and then at some point I'd be like, "Hey, it looks good." And I'd look over and like Danny DeVito would be sitting on an apple box in our tent, and I'm like, "Oh, look, has he been there?" Like people would just come, even like hanging in the trailer, people would hang out. I don't know, it was a really fun vibe, and again, some of the coolest actors around, and to see them all together feels crazy and bizarre, and yeah, a real dream come true. A really one of a kind experience to work with.
And do you remember a specific scene that maybe took the most work or changed the most as you were working on it?
Oh my, yeah. A lot of stuff did change as we went, or we would shoot it, and it would be sort of rewritten and worked. I think, fun sequences that come to mind that were challenges are like the stretching room sequence or the ghost realm sequence, just creative. Yeah. What's that world going to look like, and what are the sort of cinematography tools to help tell that story? That was a fun one that I sort of got my sort of initial instinct was like, what if it's sort of the film negative of our world? So where we have all these warm lights and like sort of, silvery moonlight. Now we've got this sort of vertigo green moonlight that feels very of the ride, and you've got these pinks and purples and sort of heightened, strange sort of colors that look like they look like the film negative version of our world. But there was also some custom lens work we did there, so that we're actually using these sort of older 60s lenses, sort of from the era of the ride, that have a lot more sort of aberration and a kind of a different way of looking at the world. They also are a little bit more distorted in the wides and use a lot more of the sort of really wide ends of the lenses. So those were really fun ones that was like on the page, Ben goes into the ghost room. There's ghosts everywhere, but what does that mean visually? It was kind of like up to us to test things and try things, put them in front of Justin, and ultimately come upon something that feels interesting and fun.
The ghost realm thing also, I love the effects in general, especially with the ghosts where they're like semi-translucent. You can like see bones kind of in there, and it's like super interesting. In terms of your work, like especially when you're working on a set, like does knowing that you're going to have all these VFX kind of considerations, like all this stuff coming in later, how does that affect what you do?
I try not to let it affect me too much, just so that what we are shooting is still in my light and still interacting in a way that feels very present.
Yeah.
That's a really great effect from our VFX folks, like the duelists. We knew that any place that like a little slash of hard light might hit them would be a place you'd see bones. So it would influence us in that way of being like, oh, let's make sure that we can kind of see through this way, because we know how the mechanics of light through a ghost work. But that said, it was really nice to actually be shooting those people instead of just a plate and knowing they're going to put in, somebody who's on a blue screen later. We actually shot those guys. They had witness cameras so that they could create the transparency. We often used motion control so we could get transparency and still do our camera moves. So we tried to do as much in camera as we could. Obviously, like faces and things, Hatbox, Leota, those are all our friends in VFX.
For all those ghosts and all that, and Jamie Lee Curtis, like, were they all on set with you, or were they added?
So like Hatbox, who's like a fully mocap face, was his body was shot. A lot of his body is photographed. His clothes and the way the wind's working on them and all that stuff, which I think helps ground him into a bit. Jamie, I think, was fully mocap for her, except her flashback. She's actually full regalia in her scenes. But other ghosts like the bride, like the duelist ghosts, a number of other ghosts, we just photographed. They were, in special effects makeup, in full wardrobe, and they were shot with multiple angles of witness cameras for VFX. So they always had plates. We always shot plates on everything, and shot some mocap so if we move and vary and move exactly precisely with an empty plate. We can always do that as well.